Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh. I'm a high school teacher trying to bring light to different perspectives on controversial issues. And the topic that we're going to cover today is one that I've wanted to cover since I started this podcast in 2018. And who I have on today are Carlos Plazola and Larry Norris from Decriminalize Nature. I have been in this world of rethinking the drug wars for a while, thanks to Johan Hari and then Carl Hart. And then I kind of dove into MAPS and what they were doing, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Michael Pollan, his book, his new Netflix show, and his new Netflix show is where I learned about Decriminalize Nature. And I was like, oh, that sounds perfect. Diving into all of the nuance around what is Decriminalize Nature doing, what are they all about, and how we can rethink the way that we approach naturally occurring plant medications and how they can help people, especially in 2022 when people seem to be suffering a lot and looking for an out and not given one. Carlos and Larry, thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk to you and spread the word about what you're doing and for you to explain it and everything like that. I really appreciate you guys being here.
Right on. Thank you, Will. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Appreciate it.
So can you dive, just what is Decriminalize Nature? What is that? I mean, is it a hashtag? Is it a company? What is it that you guys do?
It is both of those things, I guess. It is we've created a hashtag out of it, but really it's the name of an organization that we created in late 2018. The conversation began. We were having a nice conversation at a space that Carlos held for how to build conscious community. Through that conversation, we started to have a discussion on this was before Denver or Oregon had passed their ballot initiatives. Okay, what are the differences between Denver and Oregon? What are they talking about? What's the difference between decriminalization and legalization? How would we do it differently here in the Bay Area? And should we stop with just mushrooms? Because that's what was the focus both in Oregon and Denver. And we were like, hey, we're in the San Francisco Bay Area. There are large communities of all different types of plant people and mushroom people out here, including, ayahuasca communities and DMT communities and mushroom communities and cacti communities, iboga communities, things like that. So we're like, let's have a larger conversation. Let's not just talk about this one substance. This is something that's going to be helpful for this particular thing, but let's have a broader conversation about our relationship with nature, about the fact that we are nature. And what does this mean to be criminalized? Not just as the plants and mushrooms, but as the individuals. And also, what does this mean in terms of our sovereign relationship to nature, or the self-agency of our own healing process? Then the final part of this is that really looking at this as like, these are ancestral sacred plants that have been used by people across the world. These plants are ubiquitous all over the place. And no matter where you're from on the planet, more than likely your ancestors had worked with medicinal or sacred plants to some degree. So we want to have this larger conversation about what is nature and how are we relating to it. And so we took the name Decriminalize Nature. Decriminalize is an aspiration. Now, on the city level, what we're really doing is a process of deprioritization and defunding or reallocating funds away from investigation, persecution, and arrest. And the four main categories that we speak about in terms of the plants and mushrooms are mushrooms containing psilocybin and psilocin, cacti containing mescaline, plant combinations similar to ayahuasca that contain DMT, and plants that contain ibogaine. Now, those are four main categories, oftentimes within the Controlled Substances Act outside of Louisiana, which is a whole other interesting test case because they actually went through and criminalized each individual plant by species or by Latin name. So that's a little bit of a harder thing. We're here in other places, we can do 4 compounds and it covers thousands of plants and plant combinations. So those are the main 4, and those are all on Schedule 1. We focus on Schedule 1. There are other plants that could be argued that, have entheogenic properties or long history of use or sacred use within particular cultures, but we just want to focus on the Schedule 1 experiences. So since then, we passed in 2019 with the unanimous decision, which I'll let Carlos jump into that a little bit more about how that all went down. But then since then, it's just been kind of like, we had this idea that there are a lot of us out there. The question is, were a lot of us willing to step above ground to basically, it's a lot different to vote on an issue than it is to give a personal testimony in a city council office and basically say, I broke the law. It transformed my life. I'm living today because of these experiences. and you need to pass these resolutions. And so it took a little bit higher level of risk in terms of people's investment in the process or input into the process. But it's been amazing to see. I mean, we'll look back on this and be like, wow, how did this all happen in the middle of a pandemic, no less? To pass 14 cities in a place where people are thinking about all these other things. So it's been really quite a ride, and it's beautiful to see all the different communities across the U.S. that are coming together, meeting each other for the first time and working together to pass policy. And then I'll let Carlos get a little bit into the more the Oakland side of things.
Well, let me back up a bit, and because this topic I understand is war on drugs and sort of busting some barriers about the war on drugs. So what is a drug? And I'll just read the definition here for your audience to kind of unpack some of this. Yeah. It's a medicine or other substance which has a physiological effect when ingested or otherwise introduced into the body. Coffee is a drug then. And pretty much by that definition, just about everything we ingest that has a physiological effect is a drug. What's that? Sugar is a drug, right? But what the war on drugs really did is it took a small category of synthetics and other derivatives of nature and said, okay, these are now illegal and we're going to declare a war on this, meaning that we're going to actively spend a huge part of our federal budget to prosecute and incarcerate people. And so that sort of muddied things for us. But if we look at that definition, drugs include everything from mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, to ayahuasca, to the things that Larry mentioned, but also coffee and sugar. And as early as 150,000 years ago, Neanderthals were using combinations of flowers to address headaches. I don't remember the names of those, but those were, now we would categorize those as drugs, when really our entire history as humans has been about finding those things in nature that help relieve physical pain, mental anguish, that expand consciousness. And so what we've done is we've plucked out a group of things that were categorized as drugs, but really are found in nature that our ancestors, and when I say our, I mean all of your listeners, because we all worked with nature, worked with these plants to both heal trauma, heal our physical bodies, but also to expand our consciousness, become better hunters, connect with God, all of these things. All we're trying to do is reinform people about that particular nuance of nature, because these plant medicines really were developed by us in cooperation with nature, what nature had already produced.
Yeah, like I was with the Brittany Griner situation where she's getting sentenced to prison. I'm sure we'll work out a deal, but I heard from a lot of people, especially in LA, I'm in Los Angeles, marijuana is recreationally legal here. And I was told, like, well, people don't get locked up for pot anymore. That's not a thing. Like what are the penalties? If I would have a bag of psilocybin mushrooms in theory, and I would be walking through whatever, could be Alabama, could be Los Angeles, I don't know. Like what is the span? I know it's different from municipality to, state to state and city to city, but like, are people still like getting arrested? If you have some, peyote buttons, you have some, LSD on some tabs or something like that, and you get caught with that, is that still going on in 2022, in whatever, the summer of 2022, where people are getting locked up in prison for having these things, like having mushrooms that grew, psilocybin could have grown just like, outside of your house, you pick them up, you put them in your pocket. Is that still happening, or is it one of those things where the law is looking the other way and you're focused on changing the law, even though it stands and it's not being enforced?
I think there's two things. One, there's enforcement of the law that's occurring, but there's also stigma that's being placed on these. And the stigmas are the most hurtful because it's stopping people from doing the healing work they need with these plant medicines, because people, including myself, for 30 years, I only came to plant medicine when I was 48. And the reason I didn't go to them is because in my mind, growing up in a lower income Mexican community, psychedelics were the same thing as heroin and PCP. It's the stuff we went to jail for. It's the stuff that got us in trouble. So I stayed away from it. But had I known that they were so healing of trauma and expansion of consciousness, then I would have tried them much sooner. So a lot of this is lifting the stigma. But I'm glad you said peyote, because people are getting arrested from peyote. You hear news reports. It doesn't happen a lot, but it can happen. And peyote is my own ancestral medicine. So if I was to grow peyote and an enforcement person was to come to my home and see the peyote and have cause for whatever reason to want to arrest me, then I would get up to 3 years in prison for growing peyote, even though it's my ancestral medicine, meaning that my people grew and used peyote for 5,000 years, mostly to heal their body because it has a lot of antioxidants and healing properties, but as well to expand consciousness and travel in the spirit realm. And so that's the problem. It's partially it's enforcement, but then the other piece of it is lifting the stigma so people can begin to heal with these again.
I think speak to that too. One thing we're seeing develop, and while there isn't a ton of enforcement necessarily around certain areas, oftentimes just a handful of arrests here and there. Like as Carlos said, a lot of this is reducing stigma, also reducing confusion so that law enforcement doesn't have to make that decision, like, should I arrest this person or not? Let's just make it really clear for them. But now what we're starting to see, which is really interesting because Oregon as a state is kind of a test model for everybody else. We can see, okay, well, how is this policy working out in terms of legalization? And even legalization paired up with what they call decriminalization, which isn't full decriminalization because they set limits on it. So for example, in Oregon, it's still a felony to grow a plant, which is odd. You can have a plant, you can possess a plant, but if you grow it, hold on, you've crossed the line now. That's big time, right? So it's still a felony to grow, still a felony to pick a mushroom out of the ground, still a felony to share it in a ceremony with somebody else. And the limits on something like mushrooms, the way they frame it is 12 grams of mixture or substance with a quote unquote detectable amount of psilocybin. Which means if you had a 13-gram chocolate bar with a microdose of psilocybin, that would still be a misdemeanor within that state. I just read something just the other day when this is the concern with legalization without decriminalization or full decriminalization, meaning without limits, is that now there's going to be an opportunity for what Symposia and other folks have been calling prohibition light, which is basically like, okay, we're going to legalize it, but if you're outside of this framework, you're still quote unquote illicit. If you grow your own mushrooms, you're still illicit. If you're not within the corporate state approved model, you're still illicit. And there was actually a story just a week ago, I think I read a headline, somebody got arrested in Oregon, which is supposed to be fully decriminalized because they had 5 pounds of mushrooms on them. And people say, oh, well, we need limits for safety issues, but there's no difference if that person had 4 grams of mushrooms or 5 pounds of mushrooms. There's no difference in safety just having that. It's like, oh, I have a wine cellar with 2 bottles of wine, or I have a wine cellar with 50 gallons of wine. Like what's the safety issue, right? So even in states that are being pushed forward as having been fully decriminalized and quote unquote legalized, people are still getting arrested. So we're also now getting to this area where this corporate control can leverage the law so that people that aren't following the regulations have to buy their products. Otherwise they're quote unquote illegal. So this conversation, that's what we're really focusing on, decriminalization, because legalization without decriminalization, we say this a lot, leads to incarceration. There'll be people that will now want to say, well, you don't have a license. Well, you're not growing within the system. I don't care if you're growing your own, tomatoes, as Carlos talks about tomatoes, you're growing your own tomatoes in your backyard, we're gonna go after you because you don't have a permit for that. Or you're sharing with your friends and you're cutting out our bottom line. So we have to be really cautious as this moves forward in terms of legalization, decriminalization conversation, because legalization, regulations, taxes, state-run operations run by, for example, the Oregon Health Authority, which doesn't know anything about psychedelics. They're learning on the fly, so to speak, But are those the people that we want to be creating the training programs for folks? The people that don't know anything, or do we want to tap into the people that have been doing this for a really long time, whether it's the underground, whether it's various indigenous communities that have been working with these medicines and stewarded these medicines, or other ways that people have been engaging with this that isn't necessarily trying to find out the best way to have the insurance company pay for it, because we see how that works in our regular medical system, right?
Ignorance. There's a lot of ignorance around this, and that's why I'm excited to have this conversation, blast it out, because I'm a high school teacher. Ignorance is that's my jam. Everyone's ignorant. I'm ignorant about a million different things, but the goal is to be less ignorant. So you don't want to be willful ignorant. It's like, let me highlight the things that are in the dark for me. So decriminalization, decriminalize nature, not legalize nature. So part of that, if I'm hearing you correctly, is because when it's legalized, then that'll be picked up by essentially big pharma. Is they will take it, they'll synthesize in some sort of way, the way that it's perfectly legal to my students. Many of them, especially young boys, are on Adderall. Many. It's a whole different thing. But that's fine. That's legal. And pharmaceutical companies are going to get paid because these kids are on Adderall every single day. So it's a constant like thing. But if you go out and you get some with the same chemical compound, you make it in your lab in your basement, then they will raid you and throw you in a jail cell. Is that essentially like the reason why you chose to lean into the decriminalization side? And my concern for decriminalization is always about purity. So I know it's not like maybe in your wheelhouse about like for Decriminalize Nature. So you might not be able to speak on it, but I know Rick Doblin at MAPS is talking a lot about MDMA and how MDMA is helping people through therapies and stuff like that who have PTSD and stuff. It's really fascinating. But you buy MDMA on the street, the chances are that it has fentanyl in it, which people don't want. And it's actually illegal. If I would buy some MDMA from someone, in theory, and I would say, I want to test, is this actually MDMA or is there fentanyl that could kill me? Because I don't want to die. I want to get over my trauma so I can be a better contributing citizen of this world. I can't legally go to a lab and say, test this for me. It's illegal to test for purity, while the number one cause of death for 18 to 45-year-olds is drug overdoses, largely unintended drug overdoses because of purity issues with fentanyl and stuff like that. This seems batshit crazy, for lack of a better term, pardon my language, but like it doesn't make sense for me. I know there's a lot there, but is that kind of why you're along the lines of decriminalize? And then if it is it purity is less of an issue when it's a naturally occurring plant because you kind of see what it is? It's hard to like taint cannabis or psilocybin with fentanyl. I know it's kind of a lot.
Larry, can I go 30,000 and hand it off to you in the specifics that you're much stronger on? I guess to kind of frame this whole conversation of decriminalization versus legalization, I want to start by just sharing with your audience, again, to unpack the ignorance here. It's really, in many ways, we're indoctrinated as we come into this world. We're making meaning in the world around us. Is I want to share the allegory, the following allegory. So there's two little fish swimming in the ocean, and the older fish swims up. An elder fish swims up and says, hey guys, how's the water today? And the two fish say, what's water? The point here is that we have to be conscious of the sea that we swim in. The sea that we swim in is an ocean of profiteering that has become so dominant of a culture for the last 200 years. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but we just have to be aware that this is the world that really is the dominant landscape of pretty much everything. And that was really exemplified under Citizens United getting passed by US Supreme Court, determining that they are humans, corporations are humans, all rights of humans. And so important to recognize the significance of that, because that really opened the floodgates to corporate control of our state and federal system. And this is something that can unite all of us as human beings, regardless of where we're at politically, is that we're really all in this together, fighting for love, compassion, cooperation, all the things that are sort of anti-for-profit corporations, because corporations really care about profiteering. So why do I say all that? Because when you're talking about legalization and creating regulatory frameworks, we swim in a sea of profiteering. Imagine if we swam in a sea of compassion, and that our research institutions, universities, all the great work that's being done out there with synthetics. Imagine that we lived in this world of compassion. And so really we cared more than anything about healing. And imagine that all of our politicians cared about healing humanity and enabling emergence of consciousness of humanity. Then legalizations and regulatory frameworks could emerge in a way that was about compassion, but that's not what we live in. We live in a world of profiteering and greed, with corporations really being the dominant force. So the challenge with regulatory frameworks right now is that they are quickly usurped, particularly at the state and federal level, by corporate interests of profiteering. And we've seen with fentanyl what happens when for-profit corporations with immense amount of power to hire lobbyists out of actually the FDA and DEA and other agencies within the federal government, and actually Congress people and senators to hire them upon retirement, and then to influence the FDA process, so that suddenly we have a drug swimming in our society that is killing 90,000 plus people a year, right? So that's all emergent from profiteering. So what we're doing in terms of decriminalization is really advocating for what we know to be the safest way of engaging with healing medicines, and that is in their natural form, because we have this sort of built-in tolerance. It's very difficult to overdose on mushrooms. I think you have to like eat like more than a pound or 2 pounds of mushrooms. By then you're throwing up, you know, and you can't hold it down. So it's damn near impossible to overdose on mushrooms, on ayahuasca, on DMT.
Yeah, even cannabis. Yeah.
Cannabis. So that's really, it's safe, but also you can grow it and we can begin to heal without the need of profiteering. That said, if there were regulatory models that can exist within a framework of compassion, so to heal people in the medical and therapeutic models, that would be great. Unfortunately, we're seeing that those synthetics that would be needed for medical and therapeutic due to insurance policy requirements are being usurped by for-profit corporations in most cases. And so it's dangerous, but Larry has a much deeper narrative on this.
Yeah, sure. I think this idea of, oftentimes when you hear drug policy folks or the old guard of drug policy folks, the next stage after decriminalization is legalize and regulate, or that type of thing, right? Which I guess, again, goes towards, we're gonna make a profit off this, right? Yeah. And oftentimes the tactic they use is say, oh, exactly what you're saying. This is a purity issue. You can only come to us because we have the purest material, right? And anything else you get is not pure. And while that may be true in a lot of cases, and there has been, unfortunately, quite a few, in the last 2 years, quite a few overdose deaths from contaminated substances that have fentanyl in them, they're always white powder substances.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't sprinkle really fentanyl on mushrooms and expect it to hold on and then get into somebody's system. It's just not something. And, it's always interesting too, like, there's the idea that, the fear tactic that people say, oh, on Halloween, you got to be careful because people are giving ecstasy out to your children. It's like, who's spending $30 a candy bar, which is what, like, or $15 for a candy bar, which would basically be a pill of ecstasy, and they're handing out to the children. So it's like a lot of that fear stuff comes into play. Like, we need to control this because, nanny state style, you can't handle this. Right. And so there's this sort of mentality, both with, needing to have regulations, but also around contamination and testing and that type of thing. And actually, we found that we've talked to a lot of people that even that system, that regulatory testing framework for cannabis, for example, can be manipulated and corrupted. So now cannabis places are shopping their test results. Which one's going to say I have the least amount of mold? Which one's going to say I have the least amount of pesticide? Which one's going to say I have the highest amount of THC? We're going to go to that testing company. So now people are like kind of playing that off, or even the testing itself, which should be exactly what we're expecting it to be, is being manipulated and corrupted and that type of thing. So, we're not advocating for sales at this point. We'd like to do a go local economy in the future. And as those things move forward, there's going to have to be a bigger conversation around testing and these different types of things, which are happening on a grassroots level. But in terms of growing your own, sharing them in the community, those different types of things without a sales model or commerce model, this isn't really something that we should worry about. If you grow your own mushrooms, you're not going to worry about those being contaminated, that type of thing. So, of course, you may have some challenges with growing and you have to redo, grow or something like that. But it's not going to be the same kind of thing where also just magically fentanyl is going to appear on your mushrooms and you're going to have to worry about that. So again, there were different types of things basically saying, we don't trust nature. It's like a paradigm thing, right? We don't trust nature. We have to make sure we put controls all over it. We need to cut everything down. So it's like, trim and proper for our cities. And we got to make sure that all the grass and all the trees are like in a certain space. And, it's this whole process of our war against nature that we've been doing for centuries, And so I think this is a thing that we're really advocating for, is like reminding people, like, wait a second, we don't have to go to big pharma to get this. We don't have to go to a venture capital company dispensary to get this. We can actually just grow these our own selves, like we've been doing for hundreds if not thousands of years. And so I think that's something that is a really important part of this conversation in terms of the push towards regulation, just to say, hey, you know what, if I want to grow my own stuff, just let me do it, that type of thing.
Yeah.
We don't need to legalize air. We don't need to legalize water. We don't need to legalize sunlight. We don't need to legalize the tree that's outside. These are plants and mushrooms that exist on the planet.
Yeah, I mean, and what you're saying about the profit, structure, I talk about Supreme Court cases, Wickard versus Filburn, where a guy was like held by the national government because he was growing his own wheat and keeping his wheat, and that supposedly was disrupting commerce. Like, there's so many examples of this through our history. And when people say like, oh, you guys, you're just hippies, you're just naive, blah, 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 my response to that is often, because I hear that kind of stuff, because I talk about these things often with people that are, very unfamiliar about psychedelics and things like that. I said, you know what, you can think this way too. Like you can get your hands on some of these medicines and talk to people, and you can have your paradigm of the way you understand the world changed drastically. And yeah, it's a little bit of like a pipe dream, like can't we just work through things in compassion? But these substances bring out tremendous amounts of compassion. They crush ego. They do all of these different kinds of really powerful things. And I try to explain that, like people who don't see the possibilities, because it's just, they're so closed off to what is, I guess, is possible if you just take a different paradigm shift. And it could be through substances, or it could be through just good or negative, powerful experiences. I think powerful experiences change us. I was very, very sick. I spent a lot of time in the hospital when I was young, and I think it fundamentally changed me. And it wasn't because of substances. It was just because of a new perspective on the world. But you can elicit that with substances or with traumatic experiences, positive or negative. And I think that giving people that opportunity is something extremely valuable. We live unnatural lives. We live unnatural lives. We don't go outside. We don't put our feet on grass. We stay in a 72-degree, sealed box under iridescent lights all the time. We live an unnatural life. And then we wonder, or some people wonder, why anxiety, depression, suicide, drug overdoses are all-time highs. While I love Steven Pinker's work, but he talked about how we're so advanced and, this is the best time to be alive because of birth, infant mortality and all that kind of stuff. Yes, we have lots more comfort and we have great medical facilities and stuff like that. And while all this advancement is happening, we are dropping in some very, very serious ways. And because we live unnatural lives, I was really drawn to your idea of decriminalizing nature and just about getting back to nature, even in your sense of consciousness and stuff like that.
I think it's important for your audience to recognize it's not an either or. You don't have to be a hippie or a business person, right?
Yeah.
You can be both. It's a yes and if you want to be. You don't have to be a hippie. You be whatever you want. But for the last 15 years, I've been in business, a real estate developer, contractor, and I own probably 10 corporations of varying sizes, and for-profit corporations of varying sizes. Yeah. And so you can choose compassion every day and live from that. And enough people choose compassion, the world transforms. That's the point, right? It's not like I can't force you to be compassionate. So it's not really about me changing you. It's about you changing yourself internally by expanding your narrative. When I had my first mushroom journey, that really set me free to expand my awareness. I've always worked towards good causes in my life, but to really understand that I'm creating my own narrative, that was a lesson of my first mushroom journey that was then solidified in future journeys. And they're accessible to all of us. And really what it did is it helped me be able to write my own narrative and come into the world in the way that I choose, not in the way that people are telling me to live in the world. So now I can live in the world of for-profit, but also recognize the ills of profiteering and where they fall short, and not just be a cog in the wheel, totally indoctrinated by the profiteering machine. But I can also have compassion for people in the world. I can also see an unhoused person, understand that but by the grace of God, there go I. Yeah. And live from that space of compassion. And frankly, for your audience, it's a much better place to live in when you can recognize the interconnectedness of all beings and all things in the world, and that you're just part of this greater experience. And it does address issues of loneliness. It will reduce depression if once you start making those connections that these plant medicines enable. And so that's the beauty of having those experiences, is being interconnected, and it will reduce the amount of depression in our society.
And I think kind of combining what Carlos is saying, and you as well, Will, it's really going to force us to have a new look at mental health. Just like what you're both saying, it's a powerful experience, a shifting paradigm. Carlos is saying, like this is about changing the narrative and shifting paradigms as well, and like seeing things, being the interconnectedness, all that kind of thing. That's what we're going to have to start discussing in terms of relationships to depression and anxiety and all these other things. I just saw a study that came out recently, and I haven't read the full study yet, but they're now saying a research team was looking at serotonin in the brain, and they're saying that low amounts of serotonin in the brain does not actually equate to depression. And so we have a multi-billion-dollar antidepressant industry that's been feeding people pills for, at least a decade now, if not more, and yeah, definitely more. And we don't actually know that that's what's helpful. We're basically just getting people to be in a space where they can exist as a cog in the machine, but we're not actually healing the underlying reasons for potentially what that depression is all about. And then that's depressing too, because you're like, wow, I still feel, even I'm on this medication, I still feel kind of depressed and blasé about what's going on out there. It's we're in a system that is extracting from us. And so that can be depressing, or that keeps us isolated from other beings, from other connections, and those types of things that can be depressing. So I think this is, just another example. Here we have now evidence coming out that shows this entire industry, we've been told for how long, that the reason for depression is a low amount of serotonin, and now all these drugs are being pushed on people for that. And we're finding out that's not to be true. So it's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out. Because where does that multi-billion-dollar industry go? Where do all those people that have been taking those pills for, however long, a decade or more, now they're, is that really helpful for me or not? What do I do now? And what have I been on? And how has this been affecting my personality and the way I'm approaching the world and all this type of thing? So, so I think that's what's really beautiful about this conversation too, in terms of entheogens or nature or psychedelics or whatever, is it's going to change our understanding of mental health completely. LSD was what really kind of started the move towards neuroscience anyway. Mm-hmm. Like without LSD, people wouldn't have realized that there was serotonin, because there were, maybe they would have, but it would have taken a lot longer. That was kind of the climax moment for folks being like, oh, okay, well, there must be some sort of interaction in the brain that we need to pay attention to in neurochemistry. And so that kind of, psychedelics kind of led us into neuroscience. And now maybe they're going to be the saving grace, as pharma companies have been trying to feed us with other things that don't actually work. And it's really a deeper layer of something, which is this interconnection, rather than just chemical neural imbalance.
Yeah, I heard someone say, I forget, maybe Robin Carhart Harris or someone like that said, psychedelics are to neuroscience what the telescope is to astronomy. It's like,
yeah, I think Grof said that as well, Stanislav Grof.
Oh, maybe that's it. Yeah, it's so good. Like, I think that I want to talk about the pills thing because, yeah, a lot of people in my life were on SSRIs, hard to get off. But it's the constant feeding that beast of the pharmaceutical companies, which pharmaceutical companies, yes, they do wonderful things, keeping blood pressure down and stuff like that. Sure, they do. They do good things too. They're not just evil. They're a corporation. The job of a corporation is to raise shareholder value. That's their job. They're doing, it's like the Chris Rock joke about the Siegfried and Roy getting attacked by the tiger. Like the tiger went crazy. Like, no, the tiger went tiger. That's what tigers do. Like this is what pharmaceutical corporations, they're corporations. They're raise shareholder value, but it's an infinite growth model where they're popping bottles. Hey, this quarter we're at the highest we've ever been. Next quarter, it can't plateau. It has to keep going up. So you got to keep this, and where they're going to shift that, I don't know. But I think why people are leaning into SSRIs or taking a pill from a pharmaceutical company is it's not giving you that fundamental disruptive paradigm shifting experience that is causing in the first place. It's a smoke alarm going off, and all it's doing is pulling the batteries out of the smoke alarm or muffling it with a pillow, as opposed to maybe you have a fire, and yeah, putting out a fire is scary. People have a lot of fear over a psychedelic trip. I understand it. I get it. The fear of even smoking cannabis for a lot of people or taking edibles because they've had a bad experience or they've heard about a bad experience. The idea of a bad trip for a long time scared the bejesus out of me. I'm going to lose my mind. I'm going to be crazy. I'm going to go off and some sort of crazy tangent and never come back. I'll never be the same or whatever it is. How do you deal with that element of people who are essentially uninitiated, for lack of a better term, of the fear of this is going to be very disrupting to me? Because one of the ways I approach it is like, if things aren't going well, maybe you need a disruption. So you don't maybe pop the hood and fiddle with under the hood if the car's running perfectly. But if the car isn't running perfectly, then maybe you have to go through something that you'll experience or through a psychedelic experience or something like that. But how do you deal with that kind of personal element of why people are hesitant? Because it's so much easier to take a pill. It's less fear-inducing to take a pill than it is to do some sort of like ayahuasca ceremony or something like that, where you will be thrown on your head, and people don't want to be thrown on their head. So how do you address that, or does that come up, I guess, as like a hurdle for you guys?
Let's see real quickly, and then Carlos, go ahead and jump in. I would say that's the difference again between the decriminalization and the legalization, legalize and regulate model. You hear oftentimes the pharma companies saying, "Look at 300 million people suffer from depression. We can all give them mushrooms and they'll be better." Decriminalization model says, "Hey, when you're ready, they're here. We're not trying to push it down your throat. This is a big experience. This is going to be challenging. You're going to have to face some things that you may not want to face. You might have to watch your ego get ripped up in front of you. You might have to see things that are challenging or ways that you were not being in the best integrity in certain scenarios or certain situations. Realize that there is, you know, a sacredness beyond ourselves. Realize that there's more than just the material, like all the things that can happen, because these are paradigm shatter when we're living a reductionist materialist worldview, a positivist worldview, where everything has to be measured to exist. And all of a sudden you have these mystical, quote unquote, experiences of something beyond ourselves. That's, I mean, imagine being an atheist, your whole worldview is based on that. And all of a sudden you have spiritual experience, boom, what are you going to do with that information? Now you have to restructure all you know. So I think that's something that, you know, we're not trying to push this down everyone's throat. We're saying, hey, these can be helpful. Definitely, you have the right to have control of your own consciousness and explore it. You have the right to help with your own mental health. And these things can be beneficial for that. Let us be here, support you on the other side. You know, I also run a nonprofit that does education integration support. So, you know, education on the front side, teaching people what this is all about, and then integration support, which is like a meaning making process afterwards. Somebody does have a big experience or challenging experience. What do they do with that information? How do they engage with people? So we're also training people across the US on doing integration work and that type of thing, peer circles, just to gather in community and realize like, oh, I wasn't the only one that had this really strange and unusual experience. This is a common feature. And now how do I sort of deal with that? How do I take that insight and maybe not make a, you know, because sometimes there's the quote, always wait about 2 weeks before making any major decisions after an experience. So don't quit your job the next day. Don't break up with your partner the next day. Even sometimes settle in. What was the lesson that was learned? What where you're on that, you know, by having those communities available for people to talk about it, I think creates a safety net, if you will, that people that are on the fence might be like, you know what, actually, I think I feel pretty comfortable with giving this a try. And then this is an education process, as Carlos said earlier. This is about reducing stigma. It's about reducing fear, and also, like, you know, telling people like, yes, it's okay to be afraid every once in a while for these big experiences, because you are just going to have to review things, you know, or have a big experience that might be intense, you know, but to have a community around you that can support you in that process is going to be super helpful. So yes, I would say that would be the big difference. We're not trying to, you know, shove it down 300 million people's throats, but we are saying like, let's not arrest people that are doing this work. We really see it as a risk reduction strategy too, when you decriminalize, because then people can go and find that support system. You know, the people that are doing this underground, that have been doing this for a long time, can come above ground, say, we're here, we can offer support, we can offer education, those different types of things. And you can't really do that when it's criminalized.
Yeah, right on. So I'll offer this perspective just for ease of sharing. I'll simplify things to say there's in this space really two categories of people, although, you know, of course, people live on a spectrum, but for purpose of conversation, let's say there's two categories. There's those people who want to be sedated and live their life as they're currently living without having too much struggle, but they don't want too much disruption. And then there's those who want to be liberated, live their full, you know, at the end of the day, you're only going to be a human. So, but within that parameter of being human, there's infinite realms of exploration of what this life is and who you are. So for those who want to be liberated from the indoctrination of this world, to explore that, these plant medicines are a tremendous help. But, you know, you have to be, have some courage in stepping into it, because those bad trips are really the teachers for you. And so as you step into them, and you have those, you know, my own personal journey of ridding myself of the impact of experiencing violence as a young person. And I find it useful sometimes to kind of tell those vulnerable stories, because it connects with people on a human level, to get rid of that kind of deep violence that I experienced and shed myself of it. It took me a good 3 years of deep work to finally, and what's cool about it is you're sort of like this conscious being exploring these dimensions of your emotions as you're in there, and really unpacking things if that's your intention. And so I came face to face with those moments of violence, and I confronted them, and I basically sat with them and set them free. And it was really incredible, you know, subsequent to that, just the feeling of liberation, of exploration. My imagination was set free, no longer bounded by those moments. And so there's tremendous beauty in this life to be had by having the courage to step into that path of liberation. But it definitely is something that people want to have to do. Otherwise, there are those tools for sedation out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard recently about the region beta paradox, where it's like essentially things have to almost get worse before you're willing to do the things to make them better. People become like that, like comfortably numb, like the Pink Floyd song. Like you have, you have your house, and you have your favorite, mass singer on TV every night. You watch the family, you have your refrigerator full of food. It's like things are bad, you're depressed and you're taking pills, but they're not that bad. And it's almost like you have to get like worse for you to be willing to take the leap to get better. And what you said, Larry, about like what do you do when you have this in a world where everything needs to be measurable? I love that Albert Einstein quote, not everything that counts can be counted. But we live in a world where it seems like everything needs to be counted. But Roland Griffiths, I love what he's doing. He's worked with psilocybin, and he's like a nerd. Like he's just a science guy, and he's just like, I don't, he's like, just shrugs. He's like, I don't know what to do with this, but these people are having this very profound experience that's quantifiable in terms of like, they all have experienced similar things, but we don't even know what box to put this in as a scientist, and it's not addictive. One of the problems with that, why drugs are made illegal, is that the people get addicted to it, is what they say. These plant medicines that you're talking about decriminalizing are not addictive. What is addictive is all of the things that the people probably in my neighborhood are on. Those are addictive. Those you go through physical withdrawals on and things like that. A lot of these things, psilocybin and whatnot, like they're almost like anti-addictive. It's like, whoa, I need to process this. I don't want to do this day in and day out. It almost has the opposite effect. Would you say that that's accurate?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Not only are they anti-addictive, or that you're not going to want to do them a ton, and I think that's where some of these sort of billionaire companies get lost too, is they think, oh, this is going to be another cannabis, but nobody's doing mushrooms every day, or even every other week, or maybe every couple months, or even once a year, maybe. Some of these experiences can be pretty big, so that's really important. But I think the other thing about this is that they actually help with addiction. So, for example, you're seeing, and I haven't. There's some methodological questions I have about this, but for example, you're seeing papers related to tobacco cessation and mushrooms. You're seeing ayahuasca being used to help with cocaine addictions and other things like that, or substance use issues. And then the big one is ibogaine, and ibogaine has an incredible success rate for opioid substance use issues. So much so that I think they're saying general stats now would be like high 30s to 50% success rate, with typical like treatments right now around 10% success rate, and that's without a good follow-up. And what the key with that is it's a big journey. It's like a 36-hour experience. But what happens, they sort of this was a plant that was used in Gabon by the Bwiti and some cultures before that, to go back to the ancestors. Someone accidentally found out in the 70s that it also is really great for basically being they called it an addiction interrupter. Right. And so what ends up happening is that now somebody has a window of opportunity after the experience of about 5 to 10 days where they don't have any withdrawals and any cravings. And so for people that are on the fence and are like ready to quit, but they can't just get over the sickness, they have now a window of opportunity to reset new patterns, reset new behaviors, reset new habits, things like that, so they can get out of it. And so I have a friend of mine that had been, had issues with heroin for about 20 some years. He had one of the first study participants in Dr. Mash's studies in St. Kitts in, I think, the early 2000s, late 1990s, something like that. 3-day experience, and now he's been 20 some years without heroin. Now it took some work on the other side of him actually having to do the work and that type of thing, but he said it gave him the opportunity to not only have to worry about the withdrawals and the cravings, but he said he went back to, as Carlos was saying earlier, he went back to his memories that were traumatic, and he was able to review them. And he says, with the emotion volume turned down, like I could now look at this experience in a different way. I wasn't so attached to it. I could see, oh wow, I see these different perspectives, and now I have a new understanding of this experience. And he says those things in combination were really, really helpful for getting him off of heroin. So these not only are not addictive, but actually can be helpful for substance use issues in general.
Yeah. I think about it like I try to explain to people like this, like the order chaos, left and right brain stuff. If you are stuck in like a rut, the default mode network, Robin Carter Harris talks about that, like the almost like ski ruts, is it kind of lays down a layer of fresh snow so you can go kind of freely. It adds a little bit of chaos. Like if you have like schizophrenia in your family or something like that, then it's probably maybe not for you, something you really dive into more. But if you are stuck, if you're like one of the obsessive compulsive types, you're very just like, or like boxed in, you feel that way, addiction, all of that kind of stuff. These, like that kind of like overly structured kinds of things where you're addicted to this like routine and stuff like that. It throws some chaos in there. You're up against changing laws. I'm a civics teacher and I'm a government teacher, and I wish that things work the way that they work in the textbook, but I've shaken my textbook. I don't really even use a textbook anymore. Because it's just like, that's not the way it actually pans out. I had Larry Sharp on my podcast, who was a gubernatorial candidate for governor of New York, and lost to Cuomo or whatever. But he was talking about trying to get on the ballot again. It cost him like $200,000 just to get on the ballot, just to be like, seen by people. So that profit game obviously has made its way into the civic process in a really ugly way. What are the biggest hurdles that you guys and your organization have when it comes to trying to decriminalize nature, essentially? What are the biggest hurdles that you're up against, so my audience can hear that and recognize that and maybe contribute in some sort of way?
Yes. At the one of the reasons why we really focus on the local level is because at the local level, it's you and your city council member, you and your county supervisor, you and your tribal council if you live on a reservation. And you can actually have a conversation with them. You can see them in the grocery store. You can, find them in their office just down the street. But when you start getting into the state and federal level politics, it's generally a money game, because first of all, it's so expensive to run for state government, but also most people who run for state office are looking to run for higher state office, right? And almost with due respect to the politicians who aren't of this pathway, but most politicians run for office from a place of ego, right? This sort of sense of self-importance, and so that becomes a feeding frenzy of wanting to get more and more money to run for higher office, and most often it's special interests who control the game at the state and federal level. Not most often, pretty much all the time now. So the thing they don't talk about in textbooks is just how much it costs to have influence at the state and federal level. And this is a big problem in our political system in America, but I'm sure around the world. But it really, we live in the belly of the beast. Again, getting back to the sea that we swim in, we live in the belly of the beast. This is the place where capitalism really thrived, where industrialization and capitalism and corporatization really thrived. All the beautiful things that emerged from that, we don't discount. Zoom, we're here talking, that's beautiful. But there's a downside to it, and the downside is that they've really co-opted our government at the state and federal level. When we were working on SB 519, which is the California bill to decriminalize entheogens, it completely got co-opted by corporate interests who were funding the Senator Scott Wiener, and he shifted his direction on the bill to placate corporate interests and set limits for us, the people, on our medicines without any pushback, just because they wanted it, right? So limit us, free the corporations to sell us back whatever synthetics they want. That's the game. And he bought it. Why did he buy it? He's a good guy, right? But he wants higher office. And so if you want higher office, you're willing to make compromises where, hey, you'll give me 10 million bucks the next time I run. And yeah, I'll do this little thing with limits. It seems pretty insignificant, but they're not insignificant, because millions of these kinds of little decisions give us what we have, which is people unhoused, living under bridges in urban areas and non-urban areas because they don't have healthcare, because they didn't have good education systems, they don't have job opportunities, because it's an upward suck of resources towards more powerful people, and it gets extracted out of communities. So that's why we're really focusing our efforts at the city level, where we still can have an impact in the civic engagement process.
Is that a risk though, because it is still federally illegal? Like there were a lot of even during Obama, who, it was frustrating because he talked openly about smoking marijuana and how it like helped him through processes in his life, but then he shut down a bunch of dispensaries during his administration here in California when it was medically legal. And I have talked to people who were like cancer patients. I mean, I can be fully open about this now. I've talked about being sick when in my early 20s, and I had smoked pot in high school and then stopped, and I was very sick. I mean, in and out of the hospital, and I was nauseous. I was in so much pain, and they would give me Zolfram or whatever, like the nausea medicine. And I remember one day, and my friends were like, "Just smoke weed, man. Just smoke weed." And I was like, "Eh." And I got down. I'm 6'3". I got down to like 155 pounds. Just couldn't eat. I couldn't eat food. I was in so much pain. They didn't know what was wrong with me at the time, and I couldn't even keep down water. And I remember I looked down and I saw the pills, the anti-nausea pills in the toilet. And I called my friend, and I was like, he's like a stand-up comedian, pothead kid. And I was like, all right, I'm in. And he's like, I'll be at your house in a half hour. I was like, 45 minutes away. He's like, I'll be there. And he showed up with his bong and his weed and two big pizzas. I smoked pot and I ate the pizzas and kept them down. And that's just my experience. That's nothing compared to the experience of people who, that same friend of mine, when he was in university, would drive from Penn State, where he went, to Philadelphia, where his girlfriend at the time's dad was going through cancer. And he would go and deliver him marijuana to help him basically fight off the disease during his chemotherapy and stuff like that. I mean, it is obviously very, very helpful for a lot of people, but people were getting shut down here in California and losing that crutch of theirs to get them through cancers. Isn't that still a threat? If you just go on the local level, isn't it a threat though, that you could still always have the risk of, like, I could get arrested by the national government? Or is the national government just kind of blanket, like, we're going to look the other way on this kind of stuff?
So let's give the let's teach a class called The Physics of Politics to your audience, and let's start with a fundamental truth. Excuse me. We'll start with a fundamental truth, which is, it's not about the law, it's about power. That's what they don't teach you in the textbooks, right? Yes, law matters, but at the end of the day, as we've learned, it's about power, and who wields the power, and what can they do with that power, and how can they interpret laws with that power. So cannabis is still illegal at the federal level, but they're not enforcing anymore. Why? Because the physics of politics is that the power of all of those states to wield their attorneys to fight, and their money, and their tax money now, to fight back against the federal government, means the federal government doesn't have the power or the resources to fuel that power to now shut down all those states. So if somebody comes into the federal government and says, hey, we want to shut down all these states, they're going to be met with a ferocious amount of lawyers and campaign strategists who will make sure that president who pushes that agenda is no longer president the next time around. So that's the physics of power. What we're saying is that at the local level, if we can get enough cities decriminalized, we don't need the state and the feds, because now we have power of cities, because they also wield power. And if you think about, there's a very wonderful economist, Jeremy Rifkin, taught at the Wharton School of Business, has taught many Fortune 500 companies. And what he is saying is, based on where technology is now shifting all of our commerce, we will see more and more power being wielded by cities and regions, bioregions. And it's going to be driven by things like the need to fix climate change impacts. And so in a number of years, he thinks as little as 8 years, but let's say it's 20 years, more and more power will be vested in cities. So we're banking on that. And frankly, that's a good thing, because it's the only place where we as people in the United States still wield enough power to push back against corporate interests.
It's also American. I mean, we're a federalist system. We're supposed to have these communities. It's not supposed to be top down. That's the fundamental idea, I think, of the Constitution, is that very concept.
And I think city councils sometimes forget that. We have to remind them that there's something about the 10th Amendment, and hey, actually, if it's not in the Constitution, you can create laws and what's best for your community. And it's amazing, even city council members, sometimes either they aren't telling us they're aware of that, or they're just not aware of it, that the reminder of that is like, oh yeah, wait, bring the power back to the cities. And you think that they would want to do that sometimes, but I think there's like this fear, or like as Carlos said, this indoctrination that always goes to the top, and we can't really be, and so I think that's something we really want to engage with more, is this idea like, hey, wait a second, you actually have the right as a city to make rules for your community, and this is what I think the community wants. And we have, in all these places, there's such an outreach, some cities, it's like this, they get so many emails on this issue comparatively to any other issue that's been brought up, that it's hard for the city council members even turn their heads, because it's just like, wow, okay, wow, this is really a voting issue here. And so I think we're seeing that too, in terms of reminding people of their power, reminding the constituents that the government works for us. Another thing that we do, which I think has been really great, is like even teaching people, like, we're doing kind of like an in-person class that you might be teaching, right? How do you engage with the city council? I didn't know this before, 2018, late 2018. What is it like to talk to a city council member? What is it like to talk about an issue that's important? What about doing public comment? How do you write a resolution? And we're teaching people in cities across the US how to do that. Now, policy will pass around empty gins one way or the other, but now those people have those tools. How do we be engaged in a civic way? How do we be engaged in our municipalities? How do we make change happen? And I think that's such a big part of this movement as well, is not only just decriminalizing antigenic plants and fungi, but also reminding people that the government works for us and that we can change laws.
Yeah, that's why I'm a civics teacher. Like I was at a point in my career teaching 15 years where I can kind of steer where area of social science I want to go to, and I just leaned into that. Even if like the reason why drugs are illegal, it's a pretty gross expansion of the Commerce Clause. It's not there. It's not like it's constitutionally in there. Like drugs are illegal at all. So it's way more aligned with the 10th Amendment than it is like, that Commerce Clause of Article 1. Like that doesn't really hold up. The point, so this podcast is Cylinder Radio. And the idea, I have like wet wipes there, is that's a circle and that's a rectangle, but it's complex, right? So I'm always trying to bring different perspectives. Can I give you guys each just like a minute or so, or however time you need, to steel man? This seems so obvious. We are so aligned, like in the way that we see things. And as nice as that is to have confirmation bias, I don't like it. I constantly seek disconfirmation. I'm constantly trying to steel man positions that I disagree with. What would be the best arguments that you've seen or heard against what you guys are doing? Like, what is the stuff that you're like, okay, I hear that, that's legitimate, but I still take my stance, but I can understand the contradictory viewpoints. What is like the other side? Because it seems so obvious that this is the right move to me that I'm racking my brain constantly. I've tried to get people who are deeply supportive of the war on drugs in this podcast, and I haven't been able to do that yet. Because I want to understand, why would you be against decriminalize nature? Like, why? From an actual not ignorant point. You give that an attempt.
You want me to go, Larry, first?
Yeah, why don't you go first? Thank you.
Yeah, I would. So first of all, just recognizing that humans live in two primary states: love and fear. That's the dichotomy, the dark, the light, and the arguments that they bring forward are absolutely legitimate from a place of fear. Gosh, what if people have these and have bad trips? Yeah, that's going to happen. Yeah. Gosh, what if people have these and aren't able to continue to function in this system like they were? Yeah, that's going to happen. And so, but well, I won't say the but because I'm steel man. So
no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
So yeah, from a place of fear, there's a lot of very good arguments. I guess we just choose to step out of that because fear is our end.
Devil you know versus devil you don't type of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That
makes sense. I would say for me too, these are probably not explicit fears, but these are the fears that even get to the Controlled Substances Act in the first place, which is the fear of shifting paradigms. Like, I'm sure you heard the quote by John Ehrlichman, I believe his name was. Yeah, basically saying that, we knew that drugs weren't bad, but we wanted to go after the anti-war and we wanted to go after Black and brown communities. And this was the way to arrest their leadership and these types of things, because they were offering a perspective that was contrary to the dominant paradigm. And so that's, I think, they might not say that in terms of the fear factor, but somebody that loves the status quo, change is uncomfortable. Like, oh, I got to shift and realize there's another way to view the world. Oh, I don't want to do that, So I think that's something too that maybe isn't explicitly talked about, but I would say it'd be an underlying thing of change sometimes takes a little bit of work. It takes some effort. Status quo is really easy. You just kind of pedal along and you're kind of carried on by the river of the status quo. But we're really asking for something a little different. So I would say that would be one thing. And then, in terms of, there's also, I think, just tap into what Carl was saying around fear. Like, what is this sort of natural fear around nature? Natural, not I say unnatural, but this thing that we've seen for quite a long time. We need to control nature. We are a part of nature. Wait a second. No, we need to make sure that everything is, regulated or boxed in, or some sirens there. So that's another thing too, is just this need to control. We've even seen that even within the community wanting to decriminalize or legalize. Okay, well, nature here, but let's extract it and make it consistent. There's this need for consistency, right? And these are notoriously unpredictable. You know, you can have one experience that maybe doesn't even have much of experience, and another experience where you're like, wow, I really viewed some things that I, hadn't expected. We like predictability. So, as a Western society, so to speak. So I think there's a couple of unspoken fears and concerns that people have, but maybe those aren't things that people would, openly talk about, because it really suggests that, oh yeah, like I'm, totally invested in this status quo and I don't want change because I've been from it,
Yeah, people don't want to feel like they've been duped. They've been controlled. Like they don't want to feel like that. And I understand that. That's a disruptive, angering state to be in. And I hear that was really well done, guys. Thank you. Because I could spiral off and go, people could say, well, if that happens, then the refrigerator full of food could go away, because where's the incentive? The guy who's, working at the refrigerator factory might do a trip and be like, I don't want to fucking work here anymore. I want to go out and do something better with my life. And like, so yes, but I do believe that progress takes time and needs to take some time, because we need to work this kind of stuff out. That's where I think the detractors, if we can have conversations with the people that are against it, then we can work it out. Like, what are your fears? Okay, well, how can we put some safety nets in here to make sure that your biggest fears don't occur? And that's only going to happen through dialogue. And that's why I'm such a fan of civil discourse, is I think that we need the maybe hardcore conservatives that are like, I don't want to change these kinds of things, because they're going to be the doorman. But if we talk about that, what are your fears about me getting into the club? Like, if I think about like conservatives, progressives as like a bunch of people want to get into a club, and the conservatives as like the doorman, like you can't come in, but you can. So even during civil rights, it was like Martin Luther King in Stokely Carmichael, you got some wild ideas. No. Like, and that's probably good, because progress needs to be done pragmatically. It needs to be done over time. But if we do that, if we say like, why don't you want me in the club? Well, you're dressed this way. Okay, well, if I change my dress a little bit, it's still me in the club. Would that be okay? But you still maybe blah, blah, blah. Like we can work this through, and it can reveal, ignorance maybe on both sides, and we can figure this out. I think that's the only way we're going to get it done. And I understand the pressing nature of this, considering as I mentioned, about anxiety and depression and stuff. And we have the solution you guys are trying to get out there. But we have to do it in a way that is open to hearing all perspectives, and then willingness to engage.
I'd say yes, except that we are now, with everything you said, except that we are now in an accelerated rate of change in humanity with technological change, but there's also the driver of climate change happening, depending on where you're at, how much you deny it or not. We are in this rapid state of change, and we're facing this cliff. And so this creates a lot of trauma in humans. And so what we're suggesting is, rather than sitting in that trauma, stuck in your default mode network, there are these tools out there that can help you transform into the change in a better way, with a little bit more openness than the rigidity sometimes that can cause real serious trauma to people in their lives, because change is coming, whether we want it or not. And if you're someone that's resistant to change, you're going to have a hard time with what's coming down the road in the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. But these medicines can help you open up a bit more to transformation that's inevitable in this accelerated pace that we're in right now.
Yeah, thank you. That's
I would even say, in addition to that too, we found in a lot of different places that this conversation actually transcends politics. Democrat, Republican, independent, whatever. We've educated a lot of people that were super conservative, and they understand, there's just different ways to approach it. Something like a personal liberty issue, or something about, substance use issues, or, veterans issues, or end of life anxiety issues. Somebody knows all those different ways, even just the right to your own consciousness, or pushback against big pharma. There's a lot of different ways to kind of approach this for a more conservatively minded individual. But we just have to figure out the right conversation. But I think one thing that we're trying to avoid doing is kind of, getting us stuck in one party or the next, because then that's where then the finger pointing and then the ideologies can come into play and that type of thing. But really to sort of move this conversation beyond that, and really figure out how to speak to anybody about this, and really, open up their minds about the potentials of these for all different types of people.
Yeah. Carlos, Larry, I really appreciate you coming on here. This is, I push my students all the time, just get civically engaged, be the change you wish to see in the world, push for that change, all that kind of stuff. And you guys are doing it. It's been an honor to talk to you. How can people support what you're doing, learn more about what you're doing. As I said, that's why I wanted you guys to steel man it. It's like, I think that this is how we are going to get through. For my kids, I have my oldest is 7, 5, and just turned 1 yesterday. Like, I want the world to be a better place. I don't want them facing the stuff that these generations are facing. And I think tapping into what you guys are promoting is a major factor in that. And I hope that my kids are going to be in a world where if they want access to this stuff, what did you say, Larry? Something like you have the rights to your own consciousness or something. I love that. Yeah, like what I want that for them. So how can people support what you're doing, get involved in things like that, find out what you're doing, all that kind of stuff?
Sure. Yeah. So probably the best way to access us would be through our website, decriminalizenature.org. We have a very active Instagram page. We talk a lot about a lot of these deeper issues, talking some of the nuances of these conversations. There's a lot of nuance. A lot of people like to homogenize the conversation as like, this is the way to talk about it. We like to open up the nuance. We like to push back against power and authority. So Instagram page is at Decriminalize Nature. We also have a Twitter at Decrim Nature, Facebook at Decriminalize Nature, or you can contact us either through the website contact email list or at decrimnature@gmail.com. And we will help you. We can give you like a little starter packet, info packet on how to sort of present this to your city council, what things to consider, or a template resolution, how do you write a press release, all those different types of things. We'd love to help everyone, especially your students, get civically engaged again, or maybe that they already are, but like around this issue. And we basically, we'll meet up with meetings, we'll meet with city council members, we'll help them strategize, but we really want to empower local leadership and just be there as a support system. But those are kind of the main ways to contact us. We're always looking for donations as well. Obviously, this is, it takes some funding to make it work. Yeah. So if you want to donate at all, there's also some donation buttons on our website.
Yeah, I want to hit on that last point Larry just made. We're up against some pretty big forces, and we are entirely grassroots funded, and it takes a lot of work on my own path. I don't take money from this because I do it for personal reasons. I have children as well. 3 years ago, I asked my 16-year-old son, what does your generation think, your cohorts think about the future, given climate change and all that? And he says, we don't know that we have a future. Blew my mind. First generation that I'd ever heard that say something like that. So it's one of the reasons I do this work. But people like Larry, who just work so hard, Larry has a PhD and doesn't get paid anywhere near what he should get paid with a PhD. And there's a lot of good people like that doing the work. We rely on small contributions from people out there to help us do this work. So please consider supporting the work. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for everything you're doing. Thank you for taking your time. Time's valuable, and it's something that when someone's willing to give up their time, it's something that is so finite. It's billionaires, they're under the same watch as us. So for you to give me a piece of your morning, I really appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen. And I'm going to continue to push to support what you guys are doing as much as I possibly can.
Thank you. We'll appreciate the conversation.
All right. Take care.